3 weeks earlier, Emma had been walking home from school along the same cracked sidewalk she traveled every day, her backpack bouncing against her shoulders. That's when she heard it, a weak, raspy voice calling from the abandoned house at the end of Maple Street. The Peterson place had been empty for years, its windows boarded up, its yard overgrown with weeds that stood as tall as Emma herself. Kids in the neighborhood whispered that it was haunted, but Emma had never believed in ghosts. "Help," the voice croaked again, barely audible over the rustling leaves. Emma's heart hammered in her chest as she pushed through the waist-high grass, ignoring the way the dried stems scratched at her bare legs. She pressed her face against a gap in the boards covering the front window, squinting into the darkness. At first she saw nothing. Then movement, a shadow shifting in the far corner of what used to be the living room. "Hello?" Emma called out, her voice small and uncertain. "Please," the voice came again, stronger this time. "I'm hurt. Can't move. Been here days." Emma ran home as fast as her legs could carry her, bursting through the front door with such force that her mother dropped the dish she'd been drying. Between gasping breaths, Emma told her everything. The voice, the abandoned house, someone trapped and hurt. Her mother, Patricia, listened with growing concern, then immediately called the police. Officer Daniels arrived 20 minutes later, his patrol car's lights casting blue and red, shadows across their living room walls. He was kind but skeptical as Emma repeated her story. He agreed to check the Peterson house, and Emma watched from their porch as he circled the property, testing doors, peering through gaps in the boards. He emerged 15 minutes later, shaking his head. "There's nobody in there, sweetheart," he told Emma gently. "The house is locked up tight. No signs of forced entry, no sounds, nothing. Maybe you heard a cat or a raccoon." But Emma knew what she'd heard. That was a person, a human being who needed help. Over the next 2 weeks, she went back every day after school. Sometimes she thought she heard movement inside. Once she was certain she heard coughing. Each time she reported it to a different adult. A teacher, the school counselor, the fire department, even the mayor's office. Each time they listened with decreasing patience. Each time they found nothing. The whispers started at school first. "Attention seeker," she heard one teacher mutter to another. Her classmates began to avoid her, rolling their eyes when she spoke. Even her best friend, Sophie, started making excuses to play with other kids at recess. Emma's mother, worn down by the constant calls from school and the concerned looks from neighbors, finally sat her down for a serious talk. "Honey, I love you, but this has to stop," Patricia said, her voice a mixture of frustration and worry. "I know you want to help people, but you can't keep making up stories. It's causing problems." "I'm not making it up," Emma insisted, her small hands balled into fists. "Someone is in that house. They're hurt and scared, and everyone's ignoring them." That's when the school board got involved. There was talk of psychological evaluation, of Emma needing special attention. The principal suggested that her persistent delusions might be a cry for help, perhaps stemming from her father's deployment. Master Chief Petty Officer David Patterson had been overseas for 8 months, leading a SEAL unit through classified operations that his family knew nothing about. Maybe, the adults theorized, Emma was acting out because she missed her dad. The breaking point came on a gray Tuesday afternoon when Emma, desperate and frustrated, cut through the Peterson property on her way home from school. She was determined to find a way inside, to prove once and for all that she wasn't lying. She was so focused on examining the back door that she didn't notice the police car pulling up until Officer Daniels called her name. "Emma, you're trespassing," he said, not unkindly. "I'm going to need to take you home and have a talk with your mother." The meeting that followed was the worst hour of Emma's young life. Officer Daniels, the principal, the school counselor, and a child psychologist all sat in her living room, their faces arranged in expressions of professional concern. They used words like intervention and evaluation. They suggested that Emma might benefit from counseling, to work through her need for attention during her father's absence. Emma's mother looked exhausted, torn between defending her daughter and accepting what seemed to be the consensus of every authority figure in the room. "Emma, baby," she said softly, "is there something you want to tell us? Some reason you need people to pay attention to you?" Something inside Emma broke. Not her spirit, but something else. The part of her that cared what people thought. The part that wanted to be liked and believed. She stood up, her chin raised despite the tears spilling down her cheeks, and looked each adult in the eye. "I know what I heard," she said, her voice steady despite her shaking hands. "And when someone finds that person dead in that house because nobody would listen to me, I hope you all remember this moment." The silence that followed was suffocating. Then the school counselor leaned forward with a patronizing smile. "Emma, that's a very dramatic thing to say. Do you understand why that kind of statement concerns us?" But Emma was done. She walked out of her own living room and up to her bedroom, where she sat by her window staring at the Patterson house, visible through the trees at the end of the block. She pulled out the tablet her father had given her before. Deployment, an encrypted device that allowed them to send occasional messages when he had secure internet access. She typed quickly, her tears blurring the screen. "Dad, everyone thinks I'm a liar, but I'm not. I hurt someone who needs help and nobody will listen. I don't know what to do. I miss you. Love, your Emma." She hit send, knowing it might be days or even weeks before he could respond, if he could respond at all. Then she did the only thing she could. She kept watch. Every day after school, Emma sat on the front steps of the Patterson house, her math homework spread across her lap, her ears straining for any sound from inside. The neighbors began to complain. The school sent more concerned letters home, but Emma refused to give up. Exactly 5 days after she sent that message to her father, Emma was at her usual post on the Patterson porch when she heard the distant rumble of vehicles, heavy vehicles. She looked up to see 3 black SUVs turning onto Maple Street, moving with purpose. They stopped directly in front of the abandoned house, and men poured out, not police officers, but operators in tactical gear, their movements precise and coordinated. And leading them, his face harder and more weathered than she remembered, but still unmistakably him, was her father. "Emma!" Patricia's voice came from their own porch, confused and alarmed. But David Patterson was already moving toward his daughter, his team fanning out around the house with professional efficiency. "You were right, sweetheart," he said, dropping to one knee in front of her. "There is someone in there." Emma learned later that her father had received her message during a brief, operational pause. Something in her words, the desperation and certainty, had triggered his instincts. He'd made calls, pulled strings, accessed resources that civilians didn't know existed. Within hours, he'd received intelligence reports that made his blood run cold. A federal witness who'd disappeared 3 weeks earlier. A man under protection who'd been betrayed by someone inside his security detail. Had last been tracked to this general area before his GPS signal died. The tactical team breached the Patterson house with controlled precision. Emma watched, her heart in her throat as they disappeared inside. It felt like hours, but was probably only minutes before her father emerged, supporting a thin, pale man who could barely walk. Behind them came the medics with a stretcher. Thomas Brennan had been a CPA who'd witnessed financial crimes tied to organized corruption. He'd been in witness protection, relocated under a new identity, when his handler had turned out to be working for the people he was meant to testify against. They dumped him in the abandoned house, assuming he'd die slowly, unnoticed, in a building everyone ignored. They'd broken his leg to ensure he couldn't escape. For 3 weeks, he'd survived on rainwater that leaked through the roof and sheer determination, calling out whenever he heard sounds outside, growing weaker each day, until a 9-year-old girl heard him, and refused to stop believing. The aftermath was swift. The local police department launched an investigation into why multiple calls had been dismissed. The school board quietly dropped all talk of psychological evaluation. Emma's neighbors, shame-faced, brought flowers and apologies. But Emma didn't care about any of that. She sat in the hospital waiting room, holding her father's hand, watching through the window as doctors worked to save the man whose voice she'd heard in the darkness. "You never gave up on him," David said, his voice thick with emotion. "Even when everyone told you to. That's courage, Emma. Real courage isn't charging into battle. It's standing alone for what's right when the whole world says you're wrong." Thomas Brennan recovered. He testified, and his testimony put away a network of corrupt officials that had operated for years. But before he entered permanent witness protection under yet another new identity, he came to the Patterson house, Emma answered the door to find him standing there, still using a cane, his eyes bright with tears. "I don't know how to thank you," he said simply. "You saved my life." When I was in that darkness, losing hope, I told myself that if I could just get one person to hear me, one person to believe, I might make it. You were that person. Emma, never at a loss for words before all this started, found herself speechless. Finally, she just stepped forward and hugged him. This stranger whose voice had changed everything. The story spread, as stories like this do. News outlets picked it up, but the Patterson family declined interviews. They didn't want fame. What mattered was already theirs. A family reunited, a life saved, and a little girl who learned that the truth doesn't change just because people refuse to believe it. Sometimes now, when Emma walks past the Patterson house, which has since been demolished and turned into a small community garden, she pauses. She thinks about the power of one voice calling from the darkness and another refusing to ignore it. She thinks about how the smallest person can make the biggest difference, not through strength or authority, but through simple, stubborn kindness and the courage to care when caring isn't easy. In the garden that now grows where the house once stood, there's a small plaque that Emma's father arranged to have installed. It reads, "Listen, believe, act." Sometimes, the smallest voice speaks the greatest truth. Emma touches it every time she passes. A reminder that she carries with her always. In a world that often rewards cynicism and doubt, choosing to believe in someone, to fight for them even when you stand alone, is the most powerful thing a human being can do.